The morning mist clung to the jungle floor like the breath of ghosts, thick and suffocating in the pre-dawn darkness of January 8, 1967. Specialist Tommy Rodriguez crouched in the elephant grass, his M16 slick with condensation, listening to the sound that had haunted his dreams for weeks, the distant rumble of B-52 Strata fortresses approaching from the south. In 30 minutes, the largest ground operation in Vietnam War history would begin. 30,000 American and South Vietnamese troops were about to descend upon a 60-square-mile patch of jungle that the enemy had turned into an underground fortress. But Rodriguez didn't know about the grand strategy. He only knew that somewhere beneath his boots lay a labyrinth of tunnels stretching for hundreds of miles, filled with an enemy that could appear and disappear like smoke. "Jesus Christ," whispered Private First Class Marcus Johnson, barely 18 years old, his voice cracking with the weight of what was coming. "You can feel them down there, can't you? Watching us." Rodriguez nodded, his throat too dry to speak. The Cu Chi district had been Viet Cong territory for over 20 years. Every tree, every blade of grass, every grain of soil had been turned into a weapon against them. And now, Operation Cedar Falls was about to test whether American firepower could root out an enemy that had literally gone underground. The first explosions lit up the horizon like a false dawn. The earth beneath their feet trembled as 60,000 pounds of high explosives began falling on the Iron Triangle, that notorious stronghold where the Ho Chi Minh Trail fed weapons and fighters into the heart of South Vietnam. Rodriguez closed his eyes and whispered a prayer his grandmother had taught him in Spanish, knowing that in the next few hours he would either emerge from this green hell as a survivor or join the growing list of names carved into black granite back home. This is the story of Operation Cedar Falls, not just a military operation, but a descent into a nightmare that would test the limits of human endurance and reveal the true cost of fighting an enemy that had turned the very earth into their ally. The Iron Triangle, even the name carried menace. Bounded by the Saigon River to the east, the Teething River to the west, and Highway 4 to the south, this 60-square-mile patch of jungle northwest of Saigon had been a Viet Cong stronghold since the French colonial period. But by January 1967, it had evolved into something far more sinister, an underground empire that mocked every conventional military doctrine.
Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Haig, operations officer for the 1st Infantry Division, studied the aerial photographs spread across the makeshift table in the command bunker. The images revealed nothing: thick, triple-canopy jungle, rice paddies, scattered villages. But intelligence reports painted a different picture entirely. Beneath this innocent-looking terrain lay a network of tunnels that stretched for over 200 miles, complete with hospitals, weapons factories, command centers, and living quarters for thousands of fighters. "It's like fighting an iceberg," Haig muttered to his staff. "We can see the tip, but 90% of the enemy is invisible, underground, waiting." The tunnels themselves were marvels of military engineering that defied American comprehension. Hand-dug over 20 decades, they descended 3 levels deep, some reaching 30 feet below ground. The main arteries were wide enough for supply carts, while fighting positions were barely large enough for a man to crawl through. Ventilation shafts, disguised as termite mounds or hidden beneath false floors, provided air circulation. Underwater entrances allowed movement even when the surface was occupied by American forces. Sergeant First Class William Wild Bill Henderson, a tunnel rat with the 25th Infantry Division, had been inside these passages before. At 5'6" and 140 pounds, he was one of the few soldiers small enough to navigate the claustrophobic tunnels with his .45 pistol and flashlight. His hand still shook when he talked about his previous encounters. "You crawl in there with nothing but a pistol and a prayer. The air is thick as soup. You can't see more than 3 feet ahead. Every turn could be your last. They got booby traps, punji stakes, snakes the size of dinner plates, and somewhere in that darkness, Charlie's waiting with a knife for a grenade, knowing every inch of his underground kingdom while you're blind as a bat. The psychological warfare was as sophisticated as the physical infrastructure. The Viet Cong had learned to exploit every American fear. They would play recordings of crying babies to lure soldiers into ambushes. They scattered propaganda leaflets showing graphic images of American casualties. They used the jungle itself as a weapon, timing attacks during the monsoon rains when visibility dropped to zero and the mud turned every step into a struggle.
Captain James Mitchell, commanding Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry, briefed his men on the morning of January 8th. The faces staring back at him were young, most barely out of high school, but their eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of soldiers who had already seen too much. "Gentlemen, we're going into the belly of the beast," Mitchell announced, his voice steady despite the churning in his stomach. "Intelligence estimates there are between 3,000 and 5,000 enemy fighters in the Iron Triangle. They've had 20 years to prepare for us. They know we're coming. They're ready." The environmental challenges were as deadly as the enemy. The jungle was a living entity that seemed to actively resist their presence. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, while humidity levels reached 95%. The air was so thick you could almost chew it. Leeches dropped from branches, attaching themselves to any exposed skin. Mosquitoes carried malaria and dengue fever. The very plants seemed hostile. Wait-a-minute vines that caught equipment and clothing. Bamboo so sharp it could slice through flesh. Thorns that left festering wounds. And beneath it all, the tunnels waited. A subterranean maze where the rules of conventional warfare meant nothing, where young men from Iowa and Texas would face an enemy that had turned the earth itself into a fortress. Private First Class David "Rabbit" Kowalski from Detroit had been in country for exactly 47 days when Operation Cedar Falls began. He kept count in a small notebook, marking each day with a pencil stub that he guarded like a precious relic. 47 days since he'd kissed his girlfriend goodbye at the airport. 47 days since he'd seen his mother cry for the first time in his life. 47 days since he'd discovered that war wasn't anything like the movies. "I keep thinking about home," Rabbit confided to his squad leader, Sergeant Mike O'Brien, as they waited in the staging area. "About sitting in my dad's Buick at the drive-in, eating popcorn, watching John Wayne kick ass. This ain't like that, Sarge. This is something else entirely."
O'Brien, a veteran of 2 tours, who had extended his service rather than return to a country that seemed to have forgotten about Vietnam, understood the kid's fear. He'd felt it himself during his first operation in the Mekong Delta. The realization that you were truly alone, thousands of miles from everything familiar, facing an enemy that wanted nothing more than to kill you in the most horrible way possible. "Listen to me, Rabbit," O'Brien said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived when others hadn't. "You focus on the man next to you. You watch his back, he watches yours. Don't think about home. Don't think about tomorrow. Just think about getting through the next hour, the next minute if you have to." The psychological preparation for Cedar Falls had been unlike anything the soldiers had experienced. They'd been briefed on tunnel warfare, shown films of previous operations, taught to recognize booby traps and ambush sites. But nothing could prepare them for the reality of fighting an enemy that could literally disappear into the earth. Specialist Rodriguez had written a letter to his sister the night before the operation began. He'd sealed it and given it to the chaplain, with instructions to mail it only if he didn't make it back. In it, he'd tried to explain what it felt like to be 19 years old and facing the possibility of death in a jungle on the other side of the world. "Maria, I don't know if I'm brave or just too scared to run. Every morning I wake up and I'm surprised I'm still alive. The guys who've been here longer, they got this look in their eyes like they've seen things that can't be unseen. I'm starting to get that look too. I can feel it happening to me, like I'm becoming someone else, someone harder. I hope when I come home, if I come home, you'll still recognize your little brother. The racial tensions that plagued American society in 1967 seemed to evaporate in the face of shared danger. Black soldiers from the South fought alongside white soldiers from the North. Hispanic soldiers from California shared foxholes with Italian soldiers from New York. The enemy didn't care about the color of your skin or where you came from. They wanted to kill you all equally. Private Johnson, the 18-year-old from Alabama, had grown up in a world where segregation was still the law. But here in the jungle, his life depended on Specialist Washington from Harlem, and Washington's life depended on him. The bonds forged in combat transcended anything they'd known in civilian life.
Back home, we probably wouldn't even talk to each other, Johnson admitted to Washington during a quiet moment. But out here, you're my brother. That's the only thing that matters. The fear was constant, a living thing that gnawed at their stomachs and made their hands shake when they thought no one was looking. It wasn't the clean fear of movies where heroes overcame their terror through acts of courage. This was a dirty, persistent fear that followed them into their dreams and made them jump at every sound. Corporal Eddie Martinez from East LA had developed a ritual to cope with the anxiety. Before every patrol, he would touch the small crucifix his grandmother had given him, then check his weapon, then touch the crucifix again. He'd done it so many times it had become automatic, a prayer without words. My abuela told me this cross would protect me, he explained to his squad mates. I don't know if I believe in that stuff anymore, but I ain't taking any chances. The letters from home were both a blessing and a curse. They provided a connection to the world they'd left behind, but they also highlighted how far removed they were from normal life. Girlfriends wrote about prom preparations and college applications. Parents wrote about neighborhood gossip and family dinners. The disconnect was jarring. How could life continue so normally when they were living in hell? Sergeant Henderson, the tunnel rat, had stopped reading letters from his wife after the third one arrived. She'd written about their neighbor's new car, about the weather, about their dog's latest antics. The banality of it all seemed obscene when contrasted with the reality of crawling through tunnels filled with death. I can't handle it, he told the chaplain. She's talking about whether to plant roses or tulips in the front yard, and I'm down here in these tunnels with dead bodies and booby traps. How am I supposed to respond to that? How do I tell her that I killed a man yesterday with my bare hands because there wasn't room to use my pistol? The night before Cedar Falls began, many of the soldiers couldn't sleep. They lay in their bunkers, listening to the sounds of the jungle, the calls of night birds, the rustle of small animals, the distant sound of artillery fire from other operations. But underneath it all, they swore they could hear something else, the sound of digging, of movement underground, of an enemy preparing for their arrival.
"They know we're coming," whispered Private Thompson, a farm boy from Kansas who had never seen a jungle before arriving in Vietnam. "They're down there right now, getting ready for us, setting traps, positioning weapons, choosing the best spots to kill us." The officers tried to project confidence, but the enlisted men could see through the facade. Lieutenant Peterson, fresh out of West Point, had the same fear in his eyes as the newest private. Command experience and military education meant nothing when facing an enemy that had turned warfare into a three-dimensional chess game played in the dark. As dawn approached on January 8, 1967, 30,000 American and South Vietnamese soldiers prepared to enter the Iron Triangle. Each man carried his own fears, his own hopes, his own reasons for being there. Some believed in the mission. Others just wanted to survive long enough to go home. But all of them understood that they were about to face something unprecedented in military history, an enemy that had literally gone underground, turning the earth itself into a weapon. The last thing many of them saw before the operation began was the sunrise filtering through the jungle canopy, painting the mist in shades of gold and red. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, a reminder of the world above ground that they might never see again once they descended into the tunnels of hell. At 600 hours on January 8, 1967, the earth erupted in fire and thunder. B-54 Stratus fortresses, flying so high they were invisible from the ground, unleashed their deadly cargo across the Iron Triangle. Each aircraft carried 30 tons of high explosives, and there were dozens of them. The bombing was so intense that seismographs in Saigon, 20 miles away, registered the explosions as earthquake activity. Specialist Rodriguez felt the shock waves through his boots, through his bones, through his soul. The jungle canopy lit up like the 4th of July as 500-pound bombs detonated in sequence, each explosion creating a brief, hellish sunrise. Trees that had stood for centuries were vaporized in milliseconds. The very air seemed to catch fire. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," whispered Corporal Martinez, crossing himself as he watched the devastation unfold. But Lieutenant Colonel Haig knew better. Intelligence reports indicated that the tunnel system was designed to withstand even direct hits from heavy bombs. The Viet Cong had learned from 20 years of warfare that the key to survival was depth. The deeper you went, the safer you were from American firepower.
As the bombing ceased, the ground assault began. Operation Cedar Falls involved more than just the 1st Infantry Division, the 25th Infantry Division, the 196th Light Infantry Brigade, the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, and elements of the 1st Cavalry Division Air Mobile all participated in what would become the largest search and destroy operation in Vietnam War history. The initial helicopter assault was a sight that would haunt the memories of everyone who witnessed it. UH-1 Huey helicopters filled the sky like a swarm of mechanical locusts, their rotor blades creating a thunderous symphony that drowned out all other sound. Each helicopter carried 8 to 10 fully equipped soldiers, and there were hundreds of helicopters in the first wave alone. Private Johnson gripped his M16 so tightly his knuckles turned white as his Huey approached the landing zone. Through the open door, he could see the jungle rushing up to meet them, scarred and smoking from the bombing, but still thick enough to hide an army. The door gunner, a sergeant with dead eyes and arms covered in tattoos, kept his M60 machine gun trained on the tree line. 30 seconds, shouted the crew chief over the roar of the engines. Lock and load! The sound of 30 rifles being chambered in unison was barely audible over the helicopter noise, but Johnson felt it in his chest like a physical blow. This was it. This was the moment when everything they'd trained for, everything they'd feared, would become reality. The landing was chaos. Helicopters touched down for mere seconds, just long enough for soldiers to leap out and sprint for cover. Some LZs were cold, no enemy contact, just the eerie silence of abandoned jungle. Others erupted in gunfire the moment the first boot touched ground. Sergeant O'Brien's squad landed in LZ George, a small clearing that intelligence had assured them was undefended. The intelligence was wrong. As the Huey lifted off, muzzle flashes erupted from spider holes and concealed bunkers around the perimeter. The distinctive crack of AK-47s mixed with the deeper boom of RPGs. "Contact! Contact!" O'Brien screamed into his radio as his men dove for whatever cover they could find. "We got gooks in the wire! Request immediate fire support!" Private Rabbit Kowalski found himself pressed against a fallen log, bullets snapping through the air inches above his head. The sound was nothing like the movies, not the dramatic whistle of Hollywood, but a vicious crack like someone snapping a whip next to your ear. He could smell cordite and jungle rot and his own fear sweat.
"Return fire! Return fire!" O'Brien commanded, but half his squad was pinned down and couldn't even lift their heads. The enemy fire was coming from everywhere and nowhere, muzzle flashes appearing and disappearing like deadly fireflies.
The Viet Cong's greatest advantage. They knew every inch of this terrain. They had prepared fighting positions, escape routes, and supply caches. They could appear, inflict casualties, and vanish before American forces could respond effectively. It was like fighting ghosts. The tunnel warfare was even worse than the surface combat. Sergeant Henderson and his fellow tunnel rats faced a nightmare that defied description. Armed only with .45 pistols, flashlights, and knives, they crawled into passages barely wide enough for their shoulders, never knowing what waited around the next bend. "Going down," Henderson reported into his radio as he lowered himself into a tunnel entrance discovered beneath a seemingly innocent hut. The opening was so well camouflaged that they'd walked past it 3 times before spotting the telltale signs: disturbed earth, fresh footprints, the faint smell of cooking fires. The tunnel was a masterpiece of military engineering. The entrance shaft dropped straight down for 10 feet, then angled sharply to the left. This design prevented grenades from being effective and forced attackers to expose themselves at the turn. Henderson knew that somewhere in the darkness ahead, a Viet Cong fighter was waiting with a knife or a pistol, ready to kill him in the most intimate way possible. The air in the tunnels was thick and stale, heavy with the smell of human habitation and something else, something that made Henderson's skin crawl. As he crawled forward, his flashlight beam revealed the incredible complexity of the underground system. Side passages branched off in multiple directions. Ventilation shafts provided air circulation. Storage alcoves held weapons, ammunition, and supplies. "This ain't just a tunnel," Henderson whispered into his radio. "This is a whole damn city down here." The psychological warfare was as sophisticated as the physical infrastructure. The Viet Cong had learned to exploit every American fear and weakness. They would leave booby traps designed not just to kill, but to terrorize. A grenade rigged to explode when a door was opened. Punji stakes smeared with human excrement positioned to cause maximum psychological impact. Dead animals placed in strategic locations to create an atmosphere of dread. Above ground, the search and destroy operations revealed the true scope of the enemy's preparation. Every village in the Iron Triangle had been turned into a fortress. Innocent-looking huts concealed weapons caches and tunnel entrances. Rice paddies had been mined. Even the trees had been weaponized, branches rigged to fall when tripwires were activated, creating deadly obstacles for advancing troops. Captain Mitchell's company discovered a tunnel complex beneath the village of Ben Suc that defied comprehension. The main chamber was large enough to hold 100 people. Side passages led to workshops where weapons were manufactured, hospitals where wounded fighters were treated, and command centers where operations were planned. The walls were reinforced with timber and concrete. Electric lights powered by bicycle generators provided illumination. "My God," Mitchell breathed as he surveyed the underground facility. "They've built a whole parallel world down here. No wonder we can't find them." The fighting was unlike anything American forces had experienced in previous wars. There were no front lines, no clear objectives, no way to measure progress. The enemy could be anywhere, above ground, below ground, or somewhere in between. A seemingly empty field could erupt in gunfire. A peaceful village could hide a battalion of fighters. Specialist Washington found himself in a firefight that lasted 6 hours, pinned down in a bomb crater with 3 other soldiers while enemy snipers picked at them from concealed positions. Every time they tried to move, bullets would snap through the air around them. Every time they returned fire, the enemy would shift position, making it impossible to locate the source of the shooting. "This is fucked up," gasped Private Thompson, blood streaming from a graze on his forehead. "How do you fight an enemy you can't see?" The answer, as American forces were learning, was that you couldn't. Not in any conventional sense. The Viet Cong had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of guerrilla warfare. They had turned the Iron Triangle into a 3-dimensional battlefield where traditional military tactics were not just ineffective, but counterproductive. The tunnel rats faced the most dangerous job of all. Henderson had been underground for 3 hours when he encountered his first enemy fighter. The passage had opened into a small chamber, and in the beam of his flashlight, he saw a young Vietnamese man, probably no older than 18, crouched in the corner with an AT-47. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the 2 soldiers stared at each other. Henderson could see the fear in the enemy fighter's eyes, the same fear he felt in his own chest. They were both young men, far from home, caught in a war that neither of them fully understood. The firefight lasted less than 10 seconds. Henderson's .45 barked twice in the confined space, the muzzle flashes temporarily blinding him. When his vision cleared, the enemy soldier was dead, his blood mixing with the dirt floor of the tunnel. Henderson vomited, then continued his mission. "1 KIA," he reported into his radio, his voice hollow. "Continuing search." But the tunnels seemed endless. Every passage led to another passage. Every chamber revealed new horrors. Weapons caches, propaganda materials, evidence of torture and execution. The Viet Cong had created an underground empire that mocked every assumption about modern warfare. By the end of the first day, American forces had suffered 72 casualties, 17 killed and 55 wounded. The enemy body count was impossible to determine. Bodies disappeared into tunnels. Wounded fighters were evacuated through underground passages. The Viet Cong seemed to melt away like smoke, leaving behind only empty tunnels and booby traps. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical casualties. Soldiers who had entered the Iron Triangle with confidence found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about warfare. How do you defeat an enemy that can disappear into the earth? How do you claim victory when the battlefield itself is your enemy's ally? As night fell on January 8, 1967, American forces established defensive perimeters and tried to process what they had experienced. The Iron Triangle was still there, still dangerous, still hiding thousands of enemy fighters in its underground maze. Operation Cedar Falls had only just begun, and already it was clear that this would be unlike any military operation in American history.
The soldiers huddled in their foxholes, listening to the sounds of the jungle night, knowing that somewhere beneath their feet the enemy was moving through tunnels, planning the next day's attacks, preparing new traps and ambushes. The earth itself had become their enemy, and they were learning that some battles cannot be won with firepower alone. The deeper Henderson went into the tunnel system, the more he understood that he was entering a world that existed by different rules. 3 levels down, 30 feet below the surface, the main arteries of the Cu Chi tunnel network revealed themselves as a masterpiece of military engineering that had taken 20 years to perfect. The tunnels weren't crude holes in the ground. They were a sophisticated underground city. The main passages were wide enough for supply carts pulled by men crawling on their hands and knees. Side chambers served as hospitals, complete with operating tables carved from earth and reinforced with bamboo. Weapons workshops produced everything from booby traps to mortars. Command centers featured maps, communication equipment, and planning tables. "Jesus Christ," Henderson whispered into his radio as his flashlight beam revealed a chamber filled with hospital beds carved into the earth walls. "They got a whole damn medical facility down here. This ain't guerrilla warfare, this is a parallel civilization." The air grew thicker as he descended deeper. The Viet Cong had solved the ventilation problem with a system of shafts that were invisible from the surface. Disguised as termite mounds or hidden beneath false floors, these airways provided circulation while remaining undetectable to American forces above ground. But it was the psychological warfare that proved most effective. The tunnels were designed to exploit every American fear. Passages narrowed without warning, forcing soldiers to crawl on their bellies through spaces barely wide enough for their shoulders. Dead ends appeared suddenly, trapping tunnel rats in confined spaces where they became easy targets. The darkness was absolute. When Henderson's flashlight failed, the blackness was so complete it seemed to have physical weight. Private Rodriguez, assigned to tunnel-clearing duty despite his larger frame, found himself stuck in a passage that had seemed navigable just moments before. The walls pressed against his shoulders, the ceiling scraped his back, and somewhere ahead in the darkness he could hear movement, the soft scraping of someone crawling toward him. "I'm stuck," he whispered into his radio, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. "The passage is too narrow. I can't turn around." The response crackled back through static. "Can you back out?" Rodriguez tried, but the tunnel had narrowed behind him as well. The Viet Cong had designed these passages to trap intruders, creating killing zones where American soldiers would be helpless. He could hear the movement getting closer, the soft whisper of cloth against earth, the controlled breathing of someone who knew these tunnels like his own home. The encounter lasted less than 30 seconds. A muzzle flash lit up the tunnel like lightning, followed immediately by the deafening crack of a pistol shot in the confined space. Rodriguez felt the bullet pass so close to his head that it singed his hair. He returned fire blindly, his .45 bucking in his hand, the muzzle flash revealing a glimpse of a young Vietnamese face twisted with determination and fear. When the shooting stopped, Rodriguez found himself alone in the darkness, with a dead enemy soldier and the ringing in his ears that would never completely go away. He had killed a man at a distance of 3 feet, close enough to see the surprise in his eyes when the bullet hit.
The tunnel rats developed their own culture, their own rituals, their own ways of coping with the unique horror of underground warfare. They were volunteers, every one of them. No one was ordered into the tunnels. They were small men, usually under 5'8" and 150 pounds, chosen for their ability to navigate the narrow passages. They carried minimal equipment, a .45 pistol, a flashlight, a knife, and sometimes a gas mask. Sergeant Henderson had been underground for 4 hours when he discovered the command center. It was a large chamber, perhaps 20 feet square, with a ceiling high enough for a man to stand upright. Maps covered the walls. Detailed diagrams of American base camps, patrol routes, and defensive positions. Radio equipment sat on bamboo tables. Documents in Vietnamese covered every surface. But it was the personal items that affected him most deeply. Photographs of families, letters from home, personal belongings that reminded him that the enemy soldiers were human beings with lives and loves and fears just like his own. A small shrine in one corner held incense and offerings to ancestors. Children's drawings were tacked to the earthen walls. They lived down here,
Henderson reported, his voice hollow with exhaustion and something approaching awe. This isn't just a military installation. This is their home. The booby traps were works of deadly art. The Viet Cong had perfected the science of psychological warfare through terror. Grenades rigged to explode when doors were opened. Punji stakes positioned to cause maximum damage and pain. Snakes and spiders placed in strategic locations to exploit American phobias. But the most effective traps were the simplest ones. A tripwire stretched across a passage at ankle height, connected to a grenade with the pin pulled. A false floor that would collapse under a man's weight, dropping him onto sharpened bamboo stakes. A chamber filled with water and human waste, designed to cause infection and disease rather than immediate death. Corporal Martinez discovered one of these traps the hard way. Crawling through a passage that seemed clear, he felt the floor give way beneath him. He dropped 4 feet into a pit filled with stakes smeared with human excrement. One stake pierced his thigh. Another grazed his ribs. But it was the psychological impact that proved most devastating. The knowledge that the enemy had prepared this trap specifically to cause maximum suffering. "Medic!" Martinez screamed, his voice echoing through the tunnels. "I'm hit! I'm in a trap!" The evacuation took 3 hours. Other tunnel rats had to widen the passage to get Martinez out, all while knowing that the enemy could be watching, waiting for the perfect moment to attack. By the time they reached the surface, infection had already set in. Martinez would survive, but he would never be the same. The tunnel warfare revealed the true genius of Vietnamese military strategy. They had turned American technological superiority into a disadvantage. In the tunnels, advanced weapons were useless. Radios didn't work reliably. Air support was impossible. Artillery was ineffective. The Americans were forced to fight on Vietnamese terms, in Vietnamese territory, using Vietnamese rules. The psychological toll on the tunnel rats was enormous. They developed a 1,000-yard stare that was different from other combat veterans. Deeper, more haunted. They had seen things that existed outside normal human experience. They had fought in a world where up and down lost meaning, where darkness was absolute, where death could come from any direction. Henderson emerged from his longest tunnel mission after 8 hours underground. He had traveled over 2 miles through the underground network, mapping passages, documenting facilities, and engaging enemy fighters in close combat. When he finally reached the surface, he collapsed, vomiting from exhaustion and stress.
"How many?" asked his commanding officer. 3 confirmed kills, Henderson reported. "But, sir, that's not the important thing. The important thing is what I found down there. This isn't just a tunnel system. It's a whole other world. They got everything: hospitals, workshops, command centers, living quarters. They could stay down there for months without coming to the surface." The tunnel warfare phase of Operation Cedar Falls lasted for weeks. American forces would clear a section of tunnels only to discover that the enemy had simply moved to another level or another passage. It was like trying to drain the ocean with a bucket. Every tunnel cleared revealed 2 more. Every enemy fighter killed was replaced by another who knew the system even better. The futility of the mission became apparent to the soldiers long before it became apparent to their commanders. They were fighting an enemy that had turned the earth itself into a weapon, that could disappear and reappear at will, that could strike and vanish like smoke. The tunnels were more than military infrastructure. They were a way of life, a culture, a civilization that existed parallel to the surface world. As the tunnel warfare continued, American soldiers began to understand that they were not just fighting an enemy army. They were fighting an entire people who had chosen to go underground rather than surrender. The tunnels represented 20 years of preparation, 20 years of sacrifice, 20 years of determination to resist foreign occupation at any cost.
The psychological impact of this realization was devastating. How do you defeat an enemy that is willing to live like moles? How do you claim victory over people who have turned the earth itself into their fortress? How do you fight a war when the battlefield exists in 3 dimensions and your enemy controls 2 of them? Operation Cedar Falls officially ended on January 26, 1967, after 18 days of the most intensive combat operations in Vietnam War history. The statistics told one story: 750 enemy killed, 280 captured, 540 defectors, 5,987 tons of rice destroyed, 3,700 bunkers and tunnels destroyed, 1,100 weapons captured. American losses were listed as 72 killed and 337 wounded. But statistics couldn't capture the real story of what had happened in the Iron Triangle. Specialist Rodriguez sat in the evacuation hospital at Long Binh, staring at his hands and trying to process what he had experienced. The physical wounds would heal: shrapnel scars on his arms, a concussion from a grenade blast, infected cuts from bamboo stakes. The psychological wounds were deeper and would never fully heal. "I killed a kid down there," he told the chaplain, his voice barely above a whisper. "Couldn't have been more than 16 years old. He was trying to kill me, I know that. But he was just a kid. And I killed him with my bare hands because there wasn't room in the tunnel to use my weapon." The chaplain, Captain William Morrison, had heard similar confessions from dozens of soldiers. The tunnel warfare had created a new category of combat trauma: the psychological impact of killing at intimate range, in confined spaces, in darkness. It was warfare stripped of all pretense, reduced to its most primitive elements. Private Johnson never made it out of the tunnels. His body was found 3 days after the operation ended, in a passage so narrow that it took engineers with cutting tools to extract him. He had been killed by a booby trap, a grenade rigged to explode when a tripwire was disturbed. He was 18 years old, from a small town in Alabama, and he died alone in the darkness, thousands of miles from home. Sergeant Henderson survived Operation Cedar Falls, but he was never the same. The tunnel warfare had changed him in ways that were visible to anyone who looked closely. His hands shook when he thought no one was watching. He couldn't sleep in enclosed spaces. Loud noises made him dive for cover. He had seen too much, done too much, experienced too much, to ever return to the person he had been before entering those tunnels. "People ask me what it was like down there," Henderson told a reporter years later. "I tell them it was like being buried alive, except the grave was trying to kill you. You crawl through passages barely wide enough for your shoulders, never knowing if the next turn will be your last. You fight an enemy you can't see, in a place where your weapons don't work, where your training doesn't matter, where everything you thought you knew about warfare is useless."
Today, the Cu Chi tunnels are a tourist attraction. Visitors from around the world crawl through widened passages, marvel at the ingenuity of the construction, and try to imagine what it was like to live and fight in this underground world. The tunnels have been preserved as a monument to Vietnamese determination and sacrifice. But for the American veterans who fought in Operation Cedar Falls, the tunnels represent something else entirely: a reminder of the limits of military power, the futility of trying to defeat an ideology with weapons, the terrible cost of war on both sides. Sergeant Henderson, now in his 70s, sometimes visits the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. He runs his fingers over the names of friends who died in the tunnels, young men who never had the chance to grow old, to marry, to have children, to live the lives they had dreamed of. "We went into those tunnels thinking we were fighting for freedom and democracy," Henderson reflects. "We came out understanding that war is never that simple. The enemy we fought wasn't evil. They were just people defending their homeland in the only way they knew how. They were willing to live like moles, to sacrifice everything, to endure any hardship rather than surrender. That kind of determination can't be defeated with bombs and bullets."
Operation Cedar Falls was supposed to be the operation that would break the back of the Viet Cong in the Iron Triangle. Instead, it became a lesson in the limits of conventional military power against an unconventional enemy. The tunnels were more than military infrastructure. They were a symbol of the Vietnamese people's determination to resist foreign occupation at any cost. The young men who fought in those tunnels, both American and Vietnamese, paid the ultimate price for their nation's conflicts. They died in darkness, far from home, fighting for causes they may not have fully understood. Their sacrifice reminds us that war is not about statistics or strategies or political objectives. It is about human beings, young men and women who pay with their lives for the decisions of their leaders. The tunnels of Cu Chi stand as a monument to the ingenuity, determination, and sacrifice of the Vietnamese people, but they also stand as a reminder of the terrible cost of war, the futility of trying to defeat an ideology with violence, and the courage of young soldiers on both sides who faced unimaginable horrors in the darkness beneath the earth. Operation Cedar Falls ended in January 1967, but its lessons echo through history. In the tunnels of the Iron Triangle, American soldiers learned that some battles cannot be won with superior firepower, that some enemies cannot be defeated with conventional tactics, and that the human spirit, when fighting for its homeland, can endure any hardship and overcome any obstacle. The war in Vietnam would continue for 8 more years, but the outcome was decided in those tunnels beneath the Iron Triangle, where young Americans discovered that they were fighting not just an enemy army, but an entire people who had chosen to go underground rather than surrender their dreams of independence.